You need to leave now. She's here.
You're either moving that tractor right now, Mr. Walker, or I'm having it towed before the bride gets here. That was the first thing Vanessa Holloway said to me that morning, standing in the middle of my farm like she owned every inch of it. Cold fog rolled low across the shoreline behind my east field, thick enough to blur the fishing docks down by Lake Mercer, and the wind coming off the water carried the smell of wet cedar and diesel from the catering trucks grinding up my gravel driveway. I'd lived on that farm for 14 years. My father built the red equipment barn with his own hands after coming back from Iraq in '91. But at 6:30 that morning, with rain ticking softly against the metal roof overhead and strangers hammering white wedding arches directly into my irrigation lines, I looked like the trespasser. Vanessa stood there in a cream-colored wool coat with a clipboard tucked under one arm and a champagne tumbler in the other hand, like this whole thing was some lifestyle magazine shoot. Perfect makeup, perfect smile, expensive riding boots that had never touched real mud until that morning. Around her, workers unloaded rose arrangements while a string quartet tested microphones beside my lower pasture. "You were informed weeks ago," she said calmly, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The HOA approved this venue unanimously. I set my coffee thermos down on the hood of my pickup and stared at the temporary fencing they'd installed around my own field. "This is private property," I told her. "No county permit overrides that." She smiled tighter at that. Not angry yet, just amused. "Grant, the community is trying to elevate this area. Maybe stop acting like you're the victim every time progress shows up." A few people laughed behind her. One of the event planners looked away awkwardly, but nobody stopped unloading equipment. That was the part that hit hardest. Not the wedding, not even the arrogance. It was watching people decide, in real time, that the man who owned the land somehow mattered less than the woman holding the clipboard. Thunder rolled somewhere across the lake while another black SUV pulled onto my driveway, spraying gravel behind it. Then I noticed something worse. Two workers were driving steel support stakes straight into the soft runoff basin near the lower irrigation channel. My stomach tightened immediately. That section wasn't decorative land. It was pressure-release territory tied into the farm's emergency water system. "You need to pull those stakes out now," I said, walking toward them. Vanessa stepped sideways into my path before I could reach the crew. "Don't create a scene today," she said quietly, her voice dropping just enough to lose the fake warmth. "There are investors attending this wedding." Investors. There it was. Not community. Not romance. Money. I looked past her toward the giant white tent stretching across my field, while fog drifted low over the muddy shoreline beyond it. And suddenly this whole thing felt bigger than a wedding. Bigger than HOA nonsense. Somebody had coordinated this carefully. Somebody expected me to fold under public pressure. A security guy in a black rain jacket started toward my tractor carrying a tow hook, and Vanessa didn't even blink. "Folks like him always calm down once they realize they've already lost," she told the planner beside her. "If you're watching this from somewhere with HOA nightmares of your own, comment below and tell me your city, because what happened next only got uglier once I drove into town and discovered whose names were actually sitting on those county authorization papers." By the time I pulled into town, rain had started falling hard enough to blur the courthouse windows across Main Street, and every parking spot outside Miller's Diner was packed with pickup trucks coated in lake mud. I could already feel it before I stepped inside. People knew. The little bell over the diner door rang. Conversations dipped for half a second, and then everybody suddenly got real interested in their eggs and coffee again. That silence told me more than any legal document could. Vanessa had been busy. I slid into the last booth near the fogged-up front window, still damp from the cold lake wind outside, and Diane, the waitress who had known my father since the '90s, quietly topped off my coffee without smiling. "You all right, Grant?" she asked under her breath. "Depends how expensive weddings are these days," I said. She gave a nervous glance toward the counter. Two men from the marina sat there pretending not to stare at me. One finally muttered, "Heard you are holding up development now." There it was again. Development. Same word Vanessa used. Like my farm was already gone and I was just too stubborn to accept it. I pulled the folded event packet from my jacket pocket and spread it out beside the coffee thermos. At first glance, it looked official enough. County formatting. HOA branding. Temporary land use authorization. But the deeper I looked, the stranger it got. The parcel map attached to the permit showed my East Lavender Field merged into a section labeled Community Recreational Property. That designation had never existed. Not once. My jaw tightened. Somebody had altered the land description itself. Diane leaned closer while wiping the table beside me. Vanessa came through here yesterday, she whispered. Told folks your place was getting absorbed into a resort district. Said you already knew. I stared at her for a second. Resort district? That woman talks like she owns the county now. Outside, thunder rolled low across the water while headlights smeared through the rain outside the diner windows. I suddenly remembered the investor comment at the farm. This was bigger than one wedding. The wedding was theater. Public proof the land was already transitioning socially before anything happened legally. That was the trick. If enough people believed ownership was changing, then eventually nobody questioned the pressure campaign behind it. I drove straight to the county administration building after that. Rain hammered the metal awning over the entrance while cold air pushed fog down from the lake toward downtown. Inside, the clerk at the front desk recognized me immediately and looked uncomfortable before I even spoke. Grant, she said carefully, you should probably speak with zoning directly. I tried calling. Nobody answered. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. Vanessa has been here 3 times this week. That landed heavier than I expected. Not because it surprised me, but because suddenly I could see the coordination, the rehearsed confidence, the pressure, the social rollout. Somebody inside county offices had started treating my land like a negotiation instead of property. Upstairs, outside zoning, I found 3 wedding guests already waiting in the hallway holding champagne catalogs and floral samples while rainwater dripped off their coats onto the courthouse tile. One woman smiled at me politely and asked, "Are you with the venue staff?" I just looked at her for a second before answering. "No, ma'am," I said quietly. "I am the reason that venue still exists." The zoning director did not even invite me into his office at first. He stood in the hallway outside the department doors with his tie loosened and rainwater still shining on the shoulders of his coat, like he had just come in from the parking lot himself. Through the courthouse windows behind him, fog drifted low across the lake, turning the whole town gray. "Grant," he said carefully, "this situation has become politically sensitive." I almost laughed at that. My family's land was being occupied by a wedding operation, and somehow I was the sensitive part. "Did your office authorize private commercial use on my farm?" I asked him. He rubbed his jaw before answering. Temporary event access was submitted through the association under shared community development language. That is not an answer. He looked down the hallway before lowering his voice. Vanessa Holloway presented the property as part of a pending hospitality corridor initiative. There it was again. Another new phrase. Another layer. Development. Resort district. Hospitality corridor. Every conversation made it sound more official even though nobody could point to an actual approved project. The director finally motioned me inside, shutting the office door behind us while thunder cracked somewhere over the water hard enough to rattle the courthouse windows. He slid a folder across the desk. "Off the record," he said quietly, "you should look at page 6. I opened it and immediately felt my stomach tighten. There was a projected rendering of my farmland transformed into lakeside wedding venues, luxury cabins, wine gardens, and private docks running straight through my eastern shoreline. My father's equipment barn was gone in the image, replaced with a stone reception hall and decorative fire pit. Vanessa had not just planned a wedding. She had been selling the future of my land before ever buying it. "Who funded this presentation?" I asked. He hesitated too long. "Private investors. Names. I cannot release that." Outside in the hallway, I could hear heels clicking sharply across courthouse tile before Vanessa's voice floated toward the office doors. Calm, controlled, confident. "I told you this would become ugly if Grant stayed emotional about it." The zoning director's face changed immediately. Fear, not guilt. Fear. He stood up fast and closed the folder. "You need to leave through the rear entrance." "Why?" He gave me a look that said he did not want to answer honestly. Then Vanessa laughed outside the door. Not loud, just enough, like somebody already winning. I walked out anyway. The hallway went silent the second people saw me standing there. Vanessa leaned against the far wall beside 2 sharply dressed men carrying leather portfolios. One of them avoided eye contact immediately. The other gave me the kind of smile bankers use before foreclosing on somebody's house. Vanessa looked perfectly composed. Cream coat, hair dry despite the storm outside. "Grant," she said softly, "you really should stop making this difficult for yourself. You are presenting development concepts on land you do not own. Nobody owns opportunity forever." That line stayed with me all the way back to the farm. Rain hammered the windshield of my truck while fog rolled over the muddy shoreline near the fishing docks, and by the time I reached the gravel driveway, half the town seemed to already know I had been at county offices. Cars slowed while passing the property. People stared openly now. Somebody had posted drone photos of the wedding setup online with captions calling it the future of Lake Mercer Estates. My phone buzzed nonstop with messages ranging from concern to outright hostility. One neighbor texted, "You are hurting property values." Another asked if I planned to sue the bride. Then I noticed something else waiting near my barn. A second fencing crew, this time installing locked gates across my own access road, while Vanessa stood near the tent speaking calmly with a sheriff's deputy beside the catering trucks. The sheriff's deputy looked uncomfortable the second I stepped out of my truck. Rainwater rolled down the side of the patrol SUV parked near my lower pasture, while lake wind pushed fog across the field hard enough to make the wedding tent lights glow dull and ghostly against the storm. Workers kept moving around us pretending not to listen, but everybody listened. That is how small towns work, especially when money shows up. Vanessa stood beneath a portable heater beside the catering trailers with one arm folded calmly across her chest like she had already survived the hard part. Deputy Collins was just explaining the temporary access agreement, she said before I even reached them. Her tone had changed again. Softer now. Controlled. Like she was performing professionalism for an audience. The deputy handed me a laminated document covered in rain droplets. "Mr. Walker, the association claims this road section is under temporary shared access for the duration of the event." I looked past him toward the fresh steel gate they had installed across my gravel lane less than an hour earlier. My lane. My equipment route. The same road my father used hauling cedar posts during winters when the shoreline flooded. "Did anybody from your office verify ownership before approving this?" I asked quietly. Collins shifted his weight. County coordination signed off on the request. Vanessa stepped closer before he could say more. "Grant, nobody is trying to hurt you," she said with a patient smile that somehow made everything worse. "People are simply tired of this town staying stuck in the past." Behind her, one of the catering staff accidentally backed a generator trailer too, close to the runoff embankment, and muddy water slid down the shoreline into the drainage basin below. I noticed it immediately. So did one of my farmhands standing near the equipment shed. He gave me a worried look, but stayed silent. Everybody was scared to pick sides now. That hit harder than I expected. Men who had worked this land beside my family for years suddenly acted careful around me, like supporting me publicly might cost them something. Vanessa had turned community pressure into leverage. I folded the document slowly and handed it back to the deputy. "You know that access road feeds emergency irrigation controls, right?" Collins frowned slightly. "I was not informed about irrigation infrastructure." Vanessa answered before he could continue. "The county reviewed all relevant concerns already. Too fast. Too rehearsed." I watched her closely then, really watched her for the first time since this started. Tiny cracks were beginning to show beneath the polished confidence. Her jaw tightened whenever legal specifics came up. She kept checking her phone every 30 seconds. Investors were arriving tomorrow morning, and she needed this wedding operational before anyone questioned the land status too closely. Suddenly, this whole thing made sense in a different way. The wedding itself was not the goal anymore. The appearance of control was. If wealthy buyers saw luxury activity functioning smoothly on my farm, public perception would shift permanently before any courtroom ever got involved. A black SUV rolled onto the driveway carrying floral contractors, and one of them lowered his window long enough to ask Vanessa where they should unload imported stone lanterns. Imported stone lanterns. On a working farm sitting over active runoff channels. I almost laughed from exhaustion. Thunder rolled again across Lake Mercer while cold rain tapped against the barn roof behind me. Then my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. One sentence only. "Check the irrigation permits from 1998 before they bury you in development law." I stared at the message while fog drifted low across the muddy shoreline. And for the first time all day, my anger started turning into something colder. Strategy. I did not sleep that night. Around 2 in the morning, I sat alone inside the equipment shed with rain drumming steadily against the metal roof while cold fog rolled across the lower fields outside the open bay doors. The whole farm smelled like wet cedar, diesel fuel, and lake water. Every few minutes headlights swept across the gravel driveway as contractors kept arriving through the night preparing for a wedding that still legally had no business happening there. I spread old irrigation maps across the workbench beside my father's rusted thermos and stared at the faded county stamps from 1998. The anonymous text had been right. Buried in the original agricultural drainage approval was a protected emergency release designation tied directly to the east basin below the lavender field. Nobody could legally obstruct it. Not the county, not the HOA, not investors. Nobody. I read the paragraph 3 times just to make sure exhaustion was not making me hallucinate. Then I noticed another line farther down referencing liability exposure for unauthorized structures placed inside runoff boundaries during active seasonal pressure conditions. My eyes lifted slowly toward the storm outside. Vanessa had built half her wedding operation directly on protected drainage land. A slow knock sounded against the shed door before my farmhand Eli stepped inside, shaking rainwater from his jacket. He looked uneasy. "You need to see this," he said quietly. Outside near the shoreline, several residents stood under umbrellas watching crews unload decorative flooring panels while security guards redirected delivery trucks around the muddy basin area. Nobody talked much. They just watched, judged, whispered. One older couple from the marina turned away the second they saw me looking at them. Another neighbor gave me a look that almost felt apologetic before climbing back into his pickup. The whole town was dividing itself in real time. Vanessa had turned my land into a public referendum. Eli handed me his phone. A local real estate page had already posted edited drone footage of the wedding setup with dramatic music and captions calling the property the future crown jewel of Lake Mercer. Thousands of views already. Comments flooded underneath praising Vanessa for bringing sophistication to the area. My jaw tightened reading strangers discuss my family land like it was already sold. Then I saw something else. Somebody had leaked architectural renderings from the courthouse presentation. My barn, my shoreline, my fields, all redesigned into luxury retreat property. Vanessa was no longer hiding the plan. She was accelerating it publicly before anybody could stop her. "People are saying you are refusing development because you want a bigger payout," Eli said carefully. "Do you?" I looked out toward the dark shoreline, where floodwater moved quietly beneath the fog. "This place is the last thing my father left me," I said. "You cannot put a price on that." For the first time since this started, saying it out loud almost cracked something inside me. Not anger. Fear. Real fear. Because I could suddenly see how people lose land without technically selling it. Pressure. Reputation, isolation, public exhaustion, one coordinated push at a time. Around dawn, the storm finally eased into a cold, steady drizzle. I drove toward the lower basin to inspect the runoff channels myself and immediately spotted fresh tire tracks cutting directly across restricted ground near the emergency release valve housing. Somebody had moved heavy equipment over protected infrastructure during the night. Then I saw Vanessa standing near the shoreline with 2 investors in expensive rain jackets while she pointed toward my fields like a realtor showing beachfront property. One of the men asked her something I could not hear. Vanessa smiled calmly and answered without hesitation. "By next season," she said, "this entire place will belong to the community." By sunrise, the storm had moved farther north, but the entire shoreline still carried that heavy gray pressure that comes after a hard night of rain. Fog drifted low across Lake Mercer while generators hummed beside the wedding tent and workers spread fresh gravel over muddy tire ruts near the lower basin, trying to make the place look stable again before guests arrived. I stood alone beside the irrigation control shed holding copies of the 1998 drainage permits inside a weatherproof folder, and for the first time since this nightmare started, I stopped feeling cornered. Vanessa thought this was still a social fight. She still believed perception mattered more than infrastructure law. That was her mistake. I drove straight to Dalton Risk Management 30 minutes outside town, where most commercial event insurance in the county got processed. Rainwater still dripped from the cedar awning when I walked inside, carrying aerial maps, permit copies, and photographs from the basin area. The insurance analyst reviewing the documents was an older woman named Marianne who barely spoke for the first 10 minutes. She just kept adjusting her glasses and flipping between pages while thunder rolled faintly outside beyond the parking lot. Finally, she looked up slowly. They built temporary structures over an agricultural emergency runoff zone. Yes, ma'am. And they disclosed none of this to the event carrier? Not from what I have seen. Silence filled the office for several seconds. Then she leaned back in her chair. Mr. Walker, if these documents are authentic, liability exposure here is catastrophic. That word changed everything. Catastrophic. Not inconvenient. Not disputed. Catastrophic. She immediately requested the event policy number from the wedding vendor while I sat there listening to rain tap softly against the office windows. 20 minutes later, her expression changed again. Worse this time. The policy application lists this property as approved mixed-use recreational land, she said carefully. That classification is false. I nodded once. I know. For the first time all week, somebody with authority sounded more alarmed than I was. By noon, phone calls had already started moving quietly through county offices. I could feel the shift happening even before anyone admitted it publicly. People stopped sounding confident. They started sounding cautious. That afternoon, I returned to the farm and immediately noticed fewer workers smiling. Conversations stopped when I walked by. One catering manager stood near the shoreline, arguing nervously on the phone while staring toward the drainage basin. Another contractor was photographing support structures near the muddy runoff edge like he suddenly needed evidence for himself. Vanessa noticed the energy shift too. She intercepted me near the tent entrance before I could reach the control shed. You have been making calls, she said quietly. No smile this time. Her voice carried irritation underneath the calm surface now. I have been protecting my property. You are creating unnecessary panic. No, Vanessa. I think panic arrived the moment somebody falsified land classifications on an insurance filing. Her eyes narrowed slightly at that. Tiny crack. Tiny movement. But enough. Behind her, I noticed one of the investors from yesterday speaking in low tones with the wedding planner while repeatedly glancing toward the shoreline. They looked nervous now. Not impressed. Nervous. Vanessa stepped closer, lowering her voice. You need to think very carefully about where this goes next. I already have. For a second, neither of us spoke while cold lake wind pushed across the field, carrying the smell of soaked cedar mulch and wet canvas from the wedding tents. Then she tried a different tactic entirely. Softer. More personal. Grant, this town is changing whether you want it to or not. I looked past her toward my father's barn sitting dark against the shoreline fog. Maybe, I said calmly, but not by pretending my land belongs to people with better catering budgets. That line hit harder than I expected because two nearby contractors immediately looked away, trying not to react. Vanessa noticed it too. Public perception was starting to move now. Slowly. Quietly. But moving. Then my phone buzzed with a new voicemail from County Environmental Compliance requesting immediate access to inspect the lower runoff basin before the wedding ceremony began tomorrow morning. The environmental compliance trucks arrived just after 8 the next morning, while low fog still hung over the shoreline and cold wind pushed across the lavender rose hard enough to rattle the wedding tent walls. By then, guests had already started arriving in black SUVs and luxury pickups, their tires sinking slightly into the wet gravel as valets rushed around pretending everything was normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. You could sense it in the silence. Conversations stopped whenever county inspectors walked past. Caterers whispered beside portable heaters. Even the violin quartet under the reception canopy sounded nervous. I stood near the irrigation shed holding a fresh cup of burnt coffee from Miller's Diner when Vanessa approached me wearing a pale gray coat over her wedding event dress, trying hard to project control. But she looked different now, tighter around the eyes, more restless. You brought county inspectors onto private event grounds, she said quietly. No, I answered calmly. You built an event on protected agricultural infrastructure. Her jaw flexed slightly. You are embarrassing this entire community over a technicality. Before I could respond, one of the environmental officers called out from the lower basin. Who authorized flooring installation over this runoff channel? Several nearby guests turned immediately toward the question. Vanessa smiled too quickly. Everything was approved through county coordination. But the inspector did not nod. He just stared down at the muddy support beams disappearing into saturated ground, while another officer photographed the blocked drainage markers beside the shoreline. The energy shifted instantly. People noticed. Investors noticed. One bridesmaid standing near the champagne station quietly asked another guest, "Wait, this is actually a working flood basin?" Suddenly, the wedding no longer looked luxurious. It looked risky. That change spread through the crowd fast. A catering manager started arguing on the phone beside the tent entrance, while two rental contractors began removing lighting equipment from the lower field without waiting for instructions. Even the sheriff's deputy from yesterday kept his distance now. Vanessa saw it happening too. Her authority was slipping publicly one person at a time. Around noon, the county inspector requested a private meeting inside the reception tent. Rain tapped softly against the white canvas overhead, while generators hummed outside, and everybody nearby pretended not to listen. I stayed near the entrance close enough to hear fragments through the partially open flap. Undisclosed liability exposure. Insurance misclassification. Potential emergency release obstruction. Every sentence made the room quieter. Then came the one that changed everything. If weather conditions worsen, this event may need immediate shutdown authority. 10 minutes later, Vanessa exited the tent pale-faced, but still trying to perform confidence for the crowd. "Everything is under review," she announced smoothly. "There is no danger." Nobody really believed her anymore. You could see it in the way residents avoided eye contact with her now. People who had spent all week praising her online suddenly drifted towards safer conversations. One HOA board member walked straight past her without stopping. Another quietly got into his truck and left altogether. Vanessa noticed every bit of it. Her smile kept flickering on and off like failing light bulbs. Then the final hit landed. One of the investors approached me directly near the shoreline, while fog rolled low across the muddy basin behind us. "Mr. Walker," he said carefully, "were we informed correctly that this land was entering mixed-use conversion?" I looked past him toward Vanessa standing alone beside the reception tent watching us through cold lake wind and silence. "No, sir," I said calmly. "You were sold a fantasy built on somebody else's property." By late afternoon, the sky over Lake Mercer had turned the color of cold steel, and the entire farm carried that strange quiet that settles in before something collapses publicly. The wedding guests were still there, but the mood had changed completely. Nobody laughed loudly anymore. Expensive shoes sank into damp gravel, while clusters of residents whispered beneath portable heaters, pretending not to stare at county vehicles parked near the shoreline. Even the violin players had stopped performing. I stood near the barn watching fog drift over the muddy runoff basin when 3 more county trucks rolled onto the property, followed by a sheriff's SUV with emergency lights flashing silently through the mist. That got everybody's attention fast. Vanessa came out of the reception tent immediately, moving quicker than I had seen her move all week. "This is unnecessary," she snapped at the lead investigator before he even introduced himself. Gone was the polished community voice. What remained sounded sharp. Cornered. The investigator barely reacted. He carried a leather folder thick with documents and walked straight past her toward the lower basin, while another official began photographing temporary structures and support beams. Guests nearby started stepping backward instinctively, creating physical distance from the problem. That was the moment the social collapse truly started. Nobody wanted to stand too close to Vanessa anymore. An older HOA board member approached her quietly near the catering tables. "You told us county approval was finalized," he whispered harshly. Vanessa lowered her voice, but not enough. "It was handled." "Handled is not the same as legal." He walked away before she could answer. Several residents overheard everything. Within minutes, phones were out everywhere. People texting. Gossip spreading in real time across the property faster than rainwater down the shoreline ditch. One woman from the marina actually turned and left without even staying for dinner service after hearing the word liability. Vanessa saw it happen. Her breathing changed slightly after that. Faster now. Less composed. Then the sheriff himself stepped out of the SUV beside the tent entrance. Every conversation stopped. Even the generators suddenly seemed quieter. He removed his hat slowly and spoke directly to Vanessa while cold wind pushed rain mist sideways across the field. "Ma'am, County Environmental Compliance has issued a temporary suspension order on all lower basin activity, pending immediate review." She stared at him in disbelief. You cannot suspend a private wedding event over paperwork confusion. This is not paperwork confusion anymore. That line hit the crowd like thunder. Nobody defended her after that. Nobody. I watched residents physically separate themselves from her one conversation at a time. Investors drifted toward their vehicles. Caterers started quietly packing equipment. A bridesmaid standing near the shoreline muttered, "This whole thing feels shady now." And the woman beside her nodded immediately. Vanessa looked around searching for support and found almost none. That was the part one did not expect to feel so heavy. Watching somebody lose control publicly in slow motion changes the atmosphere around them completely. Her confidence had built this entire operation, and now every crack in it became visible at once. She finally turned toward me near the barn, rain collecting along the shoulders of her coat, while fog rolled low behind us across the water. "You did this," she said quietly. I shook my head once. "No, Vanessa. Documents did this. You just kept talking long enough for people to finally read them." Right then, another county official emerged from the reception tent carrying a bright orange notice packet, while guests openly filmed from beneath the heaters, and for the first time all week, Vanessa Holloway looked genuinely alone. The shutdown order became official at 6:14 that evening. Rain drifted lightly across the shoreline, while county officials stapled bright notices onto temporary fencing beside the reception tent, and one by one the remaining guests started leaving through the muddy gravel driveway, without speaking much to anybody. Expensive dresses dragged through wet ground. Luxury SUVs backed carefully around drainage markers they had ignored all week. The entire atmosphere felt hollow now, like a stage after the audience realizes the performance was fake. Vanessa stood near the catering trailers watching vendors disconnect generators while fog rolled low across Lake Mercer behind her. Nobody gathered around her anymore. Nobody asked for instructions. Even the HOA board members who once followed her everywhere stayed near their vehicles pretending to take phone calls. Social authority disappears quietly before it disappears publicly. That was what I learned watching her that night. The county investigator approached me beside the reopened access gate carrying a final compliance packet thick with signatures and violation notices. "Mr. Walker," he said, "the county is initiating formal review into land misrepresentation, unauthorized event permitting, and insurance disclosure failures connected to the association." I nodded slowly while cold wind pushed across the wet lavender fields. Somehow hearing the words out loud still felt unreal. The investigator lowered his voice slightly. "Between you and me, this situation exposed a lot more than a wedding problem." I knew exactly what he meant. Over the next 3 weeks, everything unraveled fast. The HOA emergency meeting turned into a disaster after residents discovered Vanessa had privately circulated development projections using unauthorized property renderings from my land. Investors pulled out immediately once liability exposure became public. The association suspended Vanessa pending legal review after insurance carriers threatened refusal of future coverage. Local gossip spread through every diner, marina, and bait shop around Lake Mercer. People who spent days praising her online quietly deleted posts and stopped defending the project altogether. One morning at Miller's Diner, the same men who once called me anti-development bought my breakfast without saying much beyond, "Looks like you were telling the truth." That mattered more than I expected. Not because I needed approval, but because the silence around town finally changed. People looked me in the eye again. The biggest moment came almost a month later when the sheriff's department supervised removal of the final unauthorized gate blocking my lower access road. I stood there in cold morning air while chains rattled against steel posts and fog drifted slowly over the muddy shoreline below the basin. The same road my father used hauling cedar lumber was finally open again. Eli handed me a cup of coffee from his thermos while workers cleared away the last wedding debris from the field. "Feels different now," he said quietly. I looked toward the barn standing solid against the lake wind and nodded once. "Feels like mine again." The strange part was that Vanessa never truly disappeared. A few weeks later, I saw her sitting alone outside county court during another rainy morning while attorneys carried boxes through the courthouse doors behind her. No crowd around her. No polished confidence. Just silence and wet concrete. She looked up when I walked past, but did not say anything at first. Then quietly she asked, "Was all this really worth it to you?" I stopped near the courthouse steps while thunder rolled somewhere far across the water. It was never about revenge, I told her calmly. It was about somebody finally hearing the truth before you sold them a lie. She looked away after that. Last week I finally finished repairing the shoreline fencing near the runoff basin. The lavender rows are growing back. The barn roof still rattles during storms. Fog still rolls over the lake every morning before sunrise. But the farm feels peaceful again in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. Looking back now, the lesson feels painfully simple. People can manipulate paperwork. They can manipulate public opinion. They can even manipulate institutions for a while. But eventually arrogance leaves fingerprints everywhere. And when somebody builds power on land that does not belong to them, collapse is only a matter of time. The truth is, the wedding was never the real danger. The real danger was how quickly an entire community almost convinced itself that ownership, history, and dignity could be erased by money and social pressure. That is why protecting what matters has to happen early, before silence becomes permission. Even now, some nights when rain hits the metal barn roof hard enough, I still think about how close I came to losing everything without signing a single document. And honestly, that scares me more than Vanessa ever did. If you made it this far, rank the story from 10 to 0. I would love to know what you think.